Hello, are we back online? Yes, all right. So a couple of things have happened. I hope your break was good. I received a few emails in the meantime, one of them quite shocking. We're going to talk about Ambedkar and Gandhi in the preamble and the Constitution in due course. I wanted you to understand that there's an invocation that's very common in preambles around the world, and that ours not having one has its own significance and history. So I'll get into that significance and history in due course. I just, while discussing the parts of the preamble, wanted to note that glaring absence, as it were. Now, what was I saying? I get distracted by the comments because, as I mentioned in the first day, I'm used to teaching in Socratic method, so we have a lot of back and forth. So I'm a little confused about just talking into space like this without having back and forth with you. I mentioned that some things happened during the break. One was an email where I received a list of more than 130 students enrolled or registering, which I hope that's not true because I don't want to mark 130 exams. But anyway, I mean, I'm joking. I hope everyone who wanted in has gotten in, and everybody has got connected to the this portal or the previous video from YouTube. I'm getting a little worried about the recording because I don't see where this is being recorded today. But I guess I'll worry about that later, and I will, like I did with the YouTube video yesterday, I'll write up a summary of what we went over. And of course you have the link to the readings. So if anyone has joined us new, we've just completed discussing the anatomy of the preamble and its 4 parts, before which we discussed the importance of the preamble, the lack of our historical understanding of its coming into being, and it's the contemporary confusion around who wanted what, where in the preamble, since people don't generally understand the anatomy of the preamble, nor do they understand the drafting history of the preamble. So we're getting into all of these difficulties, into the thick of these difficulties, and we've made only more or less 3 steps forward till now. The first is that you saw for yourself that anywhere you look, you're told inaccurate information about the drafting of the preamble. The second is anyone who is alive today knows the prominence that the preamble has taken in the public domain and in contemporary politics, not only in a progressive sense, because people like me, for example, who are politically progressive ideologically, I don't know what you are, nor care what you are, nor do you need to care what I am. Makes no difference. I'm just giving an example. We have a sense of the meaning of this preamble that we take into the public and we promote and we push and so on. But there can also be a polarizing side to it. And the polarizing side increases with ignorance. So the less we know about the drafting of the preamble and the structure of a preamble and the function of the preamble, the easier it is to become polarized about some of its concepts like secularism, socialism, and so on. So we've made a step forward in understanding a general ignorance as well as a specific ignorance, as well as an understanding of the crucial importance for remedying that ignorance, I think, for the future of India and our ability to transcend political polarization, as well as I had mentioned on the first day, I will point out to you how certain Supreme Court judgments later have misunderstood the legislative intent behind the preamble because the judges of the Supreme Court have not had access to its actual drafting history for reasons which I will discuss soon. And then the third step forward is that we have simply begun to understand the anatomy of a preamble and how it has its different parts. And I had mentioned that I'm going to focus only on the descriptive part and not even the 44 words of the descriptive part, but just the 6 central words that I think come to characterize it and that also provide the key for understanding what was the drafting intent in the minds of the drafting committee members. Now, one more sort of preliminary area of discussion, and then we move on to discuss the drafting process itself, especially in terms of rival or previous documents that could have been the preamble. So this gets back to the document that I had put on the chat very early on. Maybe so you don't have to scroll up, I'm going to do it once again right here. Send to everyone. Okay, and these documents are the table of the important dates, which I think I've just uploaded, and the text box preamble versions in DC, that means in the drafting committee. So we're about to finish up the dominant narratives about the drafting. And once we do that, we're going to get into this text box preamble versions. When the preamble was drafted, there were many rival versions, rival preambles floating around, rival documents that could have been introduced either as the preamble or into the preamble. And we're going to discuss what was taken from where, by whom, and why. Because if we understand where did these concepts that did make it into the preamble, where did they originate and what the history of those documents or those terms were, then we actually understand what our preamble was originally supposed to mean. Now, I had promised that during the break, I would learn how to upload, share screen, I think it was called. And I have to tell you, I failed miserably because my Dropbox is full and I cannot put these documents that I just sent you on the chat. I can't put them in my Dropbox in order to share them to the screen. I'm viewing Philos's screen. Why is that happening? I think you can share screen by pressing Alt-S. Oh, someone was experimenting, is it? Let me just see. You cannot minimize Zoom when you're recording. All right. I had said yesterday it didn't work so well, and I had to. I practiced a little on YouTube Live, hoping that today would be without glitches. but then switch to a new platform and new glitches. So at least I can promise you that tomorrow this will be better. Okay, now I've opened this document and someone said I can go to Alt-S. Let's see what happens. I don't think you're seeing the document on the screen, are you? No. All right. You open up the documents on your own then. I'll tonight after the class, I'll try to empty my Dropbox so that I can sync files and be able to share these tomorrow. We're going to be looking at the text box anyway, after we finish up on the dominant narratives. So to begin again, I've mentioned you'll have to open the Zoom screen and then press Alt-S, I believe. The Zoom screen. Okay, don't worry about it. I think you guys can open it on your own. And by tomorrow, I'll be able to do it. What was I saying? We've talked about the green button in the middle. Okay, I see, share screen. All right, someone has made things easy on me. The problem with the green button in the middle is that it offers me Dropbox, OneDrive, Google Drive, and Box, and these are not things that I have my files in because my Dropbox is full. So I'll be able to use the green button in the middle tomorrow after I empty my Dropbox. Okay, let's move on. So we've seen that people say that Nehru was the author of the preamble. The reason why people generally hold this opinion is kind of complicated. I've given you one set of explanations because of the objectives resolution and the idea that the preamble in its objectives part gives the objectives of the Constitution. And confusing this term, people assume that Nehru wrote the objectives resolution and therefore he wrote the preamble. Now this is, of course, false. It is the dominant narrative. I call it the UPSC narrative, and it's quite interesting because some of you perhaps have taken the civil service exams. One of the questions that is cleared to appear by the UPSC, oh, brilliant, you're viewing, I've just been hacked by Abhijit, who has stuck the document onto the screen. I don't know who gets to see that, if it's just me or everybody. Everyone can see it. Fantastic. All right, thank you. Does this mean that I don't have to do work afterwards and clear my Dropbox? I can just send all my files to you guys to share. Okay, anyway, don't get distracted by this yet. We're not speaking about it exactly, but you can see there in the central column, Nehru's Objectives Resolution, 13 December 1946, adopted 22 January 1947. If you go down to the bottom right corner on the next page, you see final draft, 21 Feb 1948, and the preamble, 26 November 1949. So this, yes, this you can compare to up the Nehru's Objectives Resolution. And if you compare this central column, Nehru's Objectives Resolution, to that what had been highlighted, or just to your preamble, basically. Let's forget about the 1976, post-1976 amendment. Then you can see a rather interesting overlap in certain respects, and I think a much more interesting divergence. So the overlap gives us one thing, which is about how much of the preamble was taken from the objectives resolution. And then the divergence gives us another thing, which is how much new was introduced and by whom was it introduced. So now if you want to look at NATO's objectives resolution, you see one of the main narratives. The interesting thing about the objectives resolution, we're going to discuss its drafting a little bit in the next session. Interesting thing about it is, where did we get this concept of Dr. Ambedkar as a chief architect of the Constitution? I'm sure you've all heard this expression, Dr. Ambedkar's chief architect of the Constitution of India. And the fascinating thing is that we basically get this idea from Nehru himself. So in a very moving speech that the Prime Minister gave on 6 December 1956, when Dr. Ambedkar had died, what do we call that kind of a speech? I've forgotten the name of it. You know, when someone, a eulogy, right? So Nehru said in his eulogy in the Lok Sabha, Dr. Ambedkar is often spoken of as one of the architects of our Constitution. There's no doubt that no one took greater care and trouble over Constitution making than Dr. Ambedkar. No one took greater care and trouble in Constitution making than Dr. Ambedkar. So this was stated by Nehru himself, and it gives us an interesting perspective over this concept of chief architect. Now, the thing we have to keep in mind is, what's the difference between an architect and an author? So, what does an architect do? An architect, I mean, I don't mean in a, if we were a group of architects, we would all have very specific and maybe complicated things to say. I mean this as an outside observer. I'm not an architect. I don't know if any of you are. But the basic general notion is that an architect designs, visualizes and designs, and works with others, like civil engineers and so on, to construct some kind of a structure that are not necessarily built by the architect herself, nor are the materials included in this process of, there's a new word now that's used, architecting. I don't know if it's made it into the dictionary yet, but anyway, in this process of architecting, I don't think that the architects are expected to create the bricks out of mud and whatever, or create the cement and the sand out of sand and whatever ingredients go into it, and so on. So the architect has a very specific function, and that function might be an overall function. It might be one of visualizing the whole, like the director in a film or something, but it's not one of constructing each and every element. An author is another interesting concept. If any of you study philosophy, I remember the screen was once hijacked by one of you called Philos. If you study philosophy, you know that it is a debate, especially from the 1980s onwards, about what the meaning of author is. So Jacques Derrida, we won't get into specifics, but there's this idea of the death of the author and the creation of the work. are all readers authors? And this has moved into legal interpretation by no less than Upendra Bakshi when he began his kind of Derridian turn in legal theory. So there's a debate. If you didn't get any of what I just said, let me just summarize. There's a debate about what it means to be an author that is quite philosophically rich. What's the difference between what I mean to write and what the reader reads? The death of the author, right? But these are questions that don't take us, that shouldn't take us too far aside when we think about the authorship of the preamble, but that we have to definitely keep in mind, because a sophisticated understanding of the nature of the authorship of the preamble has to keep into consideration what does it mean to author something in the first place. I have already hinted when it came to the invocative clause that it means to keep in mind who kept something out as opposed to who wrote something in. So inclusion and exclusion are both aspects of authorship. It's not merely who wrote the words that are there. It also must mean who is responsible for the words that are not there and why are they not there, especially when an entire constituent assembly is vying for them to be there. So the idea of authorship is a little bit complicated. The suggestion that we get from Quora and Wikipedia and so on, that Nehru was the author of the preamble, I hope you can see just by comparing the top middle column, the objectives resolution, and the final draft. I hope you can see that saying that Nehru is the author of the preamble is a not very sensible thing. It's not a very sensible opinion to hold. And you can take some time later to just compare those more closely. It's not sensible for a couple of reasons, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and that is specifically looking at column, the left top column, and comparing it with the middle column, and understanding that the left column was not authored by Nehru, and the middle column is attributed to Nehru. But we'll get into more of that tomorrow. So what we're seeing is basically the first narrative that Nehru is the author of the preamble that we first got when we checked on Google and so on is deeply problematic. But it's deeply problematic because right before your eyes, you can see the difference between what he wrote and what our preamble is. It's also problematic because Nehru himself had designated in his eulogy that Dr. Ambedkar was the chief architect. And then we have to get into difficulties about the difference between an architect and an author. We're not going to get too much into it, but I just want you to keep it in mind. Now, the second dominant narrative beyond Nehru is B.N. Rao. You can see there on the screen, B.N. Rao's preamble, 30 May 1947. It's quite interesting. Some of the most important words from our preamble, namely, now that you are an expert in the anatomy of a preamble, the declaratory part of our preamble come from B.N. Rao. So the declaratory part of the preamble, we the people of India, but then what comes next? Seeking to promote the common good, who hereby, through our chosen representatives, enact, adopt, and give to ourselves this constitution. Some of this is in the declaratory part of the preamble to the Constitution. So if one were to ask, who wrote the declaratory part of the preamble, there's a prima facie reason to say B.N. Rao. Now there's a little problem with this because there's always a problem with everything, and that is that B.N. Rao did not actually write these words. He himself copied these words from another constitution. And I'll discuss that later. But if we were to see some words from Nehru's Objectives Resolution, we see that we get a sense of the objectives part of the preamble being composed or inspired by Nehru. And if we are to look at B.N. Rao's preamble from 30 May 1947, we can see that the declaratory part was largely taken from B.N. Rao's draft preamble. But I have just mentioned that Nehru's Objectives Resolution was not written solely by Nehru, as you can see from the left top box, that actually there was an expert committee that was assembled, and they wrote a draft which, on your own time, you can compare the left top box, 22 July 1946, with the Nehru's Objectives Resolution, 13 December 1946, and you'll see that they're almost word for word identical. So the dominant narrative number one, that Nehru wrote the preamble to the Constitution based on the Objectives Resolution, problematic for several reasons, not least of which you can see where Nehru got his Objectives Resolution from the experts committee authored previously. Now, who authored that and why, we're going to discuss tomorrow. Narrative number two, that it is B.N. Rao, is also deeply problematic. You can see bottom left top, the bottom page, top left, that B.N. Rao's preamble basically gets taken up as the declaratory part of our preamble. But as I'm going to tell you later, B.N. Rao did not himself write this. He also borrowed these words from another constitution. Hey, I have an idea. Extra credit for whoever can tell me which constitution B.N. Rao took these words from. You have to change only one word, okay? B.N. Rao's preamble, the only word you have to change is India. And if you change the word India, you see word for word that that B.N. Rao took this text from another constitution. Germany, no. USA, no. Germany, no. So you can maybe try to find out. I'll tell you tomorrow, don't worry. Those are two dominant narratives about the authorship of the preamble. And yesterday, when I asked you to tell me who wrote the preamble, these were the two names that came up most. Nehru and Maitri. Maitri is getting extra credit, which is very fitting since, as we're going to find out later in the course, one of the terms of the preamble itself is Maitri, but we'll discuss that a couple of days from now. Now, these are two dominant narratives, right? Now, Rao and Nehru, and you yourself gave me these names when I asked you to Google search who wrote them. Wikipedia gives these names. I had mentioned the civil service exam. It is cleared to ask a question, who wrote the preamble to the Constitution of India? And the answer that you have to give to become a bureaucrat in this country is the wrong answer, Nehru. And I find this beyond shocking, because it's one thing to be ignorant, and it's another thing to repeatedly enforce ignorance in a country's entire bureaucracy. So the Nehruvian narrative that Nehru wrote, the preamble, is actually enforced by government. So I call that the UPSC narrative. The B.N. Rao narrative, that B.N. Rao wrote the preamble to the Constitution, is that I call that the sophistical narrative. Why? Because you have to be fairly sophisticated to know B.N. Rao's role as constitutional advisor. That's not something everybody knows. And yet, it's sophistical because it's only part of the information. I'll give you a side note here, what the word sophistical means. As you probably know, it goes back to the sophists, but you know, when you are freshers in college, freshmen or freshers are the first year, and the second year is called what? You're called sophomores, right? Do you use this expression? Like the 4-year college uses freshers or freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. The idea of a sophomore means that you know much more, you're much wiser than a freshman, because freshers don't know anything, they've just come in. So the sophos part means wise in ancient Greek. But the more funny part of sophomore is the more part, because more comes from moron. So you're a sophomore because you think you're wise since you know more than freshers, but you're actually a moron because you still haven't learned the facts, the real situation. So the idea, the narrative that B.N. Rao is the author of the preamble is a sophomoric idea because it's wiser and more knowledgeable than most people, because B.N. Rao is not a name known to everyone. It's only known to people generally in the legal fraternity or constitutional history, things like that. And yet it's ignorant because it doesn't seek to go further in and do things like compare what you have on the bottom page at the top left, which is B.N. Rao's draft, with the bottom page at the top right, which is our actual preamble. So if you compare the bottom page top left with the bottom page top right, you will see that the B.N. Rao hypothesis, that B.N. Rao is the author of the preamble, is a sophomoric view. The third dominant narrative is the kind of narrative that nation states need to keep nations together, right? So we all like to think that our Constituent Assembly was fully representative, that there were men and women and people from all different linguistic communities and castes and classes and things like that. But as any of you know who have studied, let's say, critical legal theory, you know that for the most part, legislation is crafted by elites, and it has functions that are inherent to the interests of elites, like protecting privacy, property, private property, and maintaining a kind of status quo where there is, my God, I'm forgetting my basic marks here. You know, where surplus value gets, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the base. Any of you who have studied critical legal theory understands this idea of the role of elites in drafting legislation or even basic law like constitutions. So the nation state requires a kind of cooperative effort behind the drafting of a document like the Constitution, and we tend to maintain that about the preamble itself. That suggests basically that all of the members of the drafting committee were involved in drafting the Constitution and the preamble. And this is the sort of friendly and you know, fully cooperative and so on kind of idea. So it's very useful to find this sort of idea in order to make us feel confident and proud of our nation state, and consequently, this is the sort of idea that is spread in NCRT textbooks. So if you remember, think back to things about constitution drafting in your SST books, in your NCRT textbooks, in the way that history, especially simplified constitutional history, is told in basic books in your social science education, what you find is the very frequently repeated idea that the preamble was drafted by all of the members of the drafting committee working together in concert. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to explain here. This is a narrative that has a reason behind it. And I don't want to belittle the importance of the reason, because it is very important to have a sense of legitimacy for the assembly. If we lose our faith in the assembly, we undermine our faith in the Constitution. And that is extremely dangerous. And unfortunately, as you all know, socially, this is in the process of happening right now. I'm just reading this book on the First Amendment. I have it here. What is it called? 16 Stormy Days. I don't know if any of you have seen it. But I think this is a book that has as its ideological purpose beginning to try to unravel the legitimacy of our Constitution as it stands today. And this is kind of dangerous tendency that we find socially today. So there's a great importance in this collective effort idea behind the drafting of the preamble, and that's why you will find it in books that have as their function creating good Indian citizens. That's what SST books are meant to do. That's why when you go to public schools, part of the function of the SST curriculum in a public school is to turn you into a good citizen. That narrative that you find there is that everybody participated. There's a problem with this narrative, notwithstanding how important this narrative is, which is that one of the members of the drafting committee himself said these words about the drafting. Out of the 7 original members of the drafting committee, 1 died, 1 was away in the United States, 1 was engaged in the affairs of state, and 2 could not be in Delhi owing to ill health. So you understand, this is Krishnamachari, T.T. Krishnamachari, who is a drafting committee member. In his own memoirs, writes, out of the 7 original members of the drafting committee, 1 died, 1 was away in the United States, 1 was engaged in the affairs of state, and 2 could not be in Delhi owing to ill health. In short, Krishnamachari claimed that 5 of the key persons of the drafting committee actually had little or no contribution in the process of drafting. And this is a quote from Krishnamachari's memoirs. So it happened ultimately that the burden of drafting the Constitution fell on Dr. Ambedkar. And this is what Krishnamachari says in the Constituent Assembly. And I have no doubt that we are grateful to him for having achieved this task in a manner which is undoubtedly commendable. Now, as far as the drafting and finalization of the preamble is concerned, there were only 4 members of the drafting committee present in the early meetings when the preamble was discussed, and there were only 3 members present in the later meetings when the preamble is finalized. Of course, one of those people was the chairman, Dr. Ambedkar, one of the 3, because Dr. Ambedkar, as chairman, in fact, never missed a single drafting committee meeting. And if any of you are interested in his role in the Constitution itself, you will learn that if you take account of each of the various committees for drafting the Constitution, the subcommittees and so on, Dr. Ambedkar never missed a single meeting of any of them, which is quite interesting and a little funny because most people missed many meetings. So what we find is that a member of the drafting committee himself says that the NCRT view of who drafted the preamble is false. And so what we have is, now remember, I'm not trying to undermine this collective drafting process or the legitimacy in any way. In fact, my own position is it's made all the more legitimate by the way we find that it was in fact drafted, but that's an argument to have later. So what we have is a member of the drafting committee himself saying, no, I had no hand in it, and neither did these other 5 people. You have the third dominant narrative undermined by a drafting committee member itself. So the Nehru narrative is false. The BNR narrative is sophomoric. The drafting committee as a whole narrative is denied by a drafting committee itself, which leaves us with one dominant narrative, which is Ambedkar as the chief architect. Now, once again, there's a huge difference between architect and author, and we have to take that into consideration. So to say that Dr. Ambedkar is the chief architect of the Constitution, or even of the preamble, is something very different from saying that Dr. Ambedkar is the author of the preamble. I hope you understand that point, irrespective of the sophisticated approach of Roland Barthes or something like that. Barthes was this death of the author idea. So that I was referring to. So what we find then is 3 dominant narratives over the drafting of the preamble are all deeply problematic, which leaves us with the 4th narrative, which is that it is Ambedkar. But this is itself problematic because of the difference between architect and author. And we have yet to find out what the actual historical process was, which is what we're going to get into next. So how do we find out who is the author? 3 of them are highly doubtful, but that doesn't mean that the 4th one has to be true. There could be a 5th or a 6th or a 7th alternative that we don't even know about. But given that the likely answer is one of these 4, does it follow that just because the first 3 are wrong, that the 4th is right? It's a question of logic. I think we need something more than just that basic inference. And the way that we can achieve certainty over the authorship as opposed to the mere architecting of the preamble is to go back to the descriptive part of the preamble, that is those 44 words, and specifically 6 words: justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, and nation. Now let me ask you, in narrative 1, Nehru, do these 6 words appear? Well, they certainly don't in the objectives resolution, but that's not so important. What about in his other writings? Now, as you all likely know, Nehru was a fairly prolific writer, not as prolific as others like Gandhi or Ambedkar, but a fairly prolific writer. And has written several books that are widely available today. If you go through all of Nehru's texts, all of the, what we call a corpus, the full body of his work, are you going to find each of these words mentioned? Are you going to find justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, and nation? Well, I'll do your homework for you, because thankfully we have computers that can do pretty complicated searches, and you can use a library and search systems to do keyword searches through people's corpus, so through the full body of writings. And you will not find two of these terms used anywhere else in Nehru's vast body of work. Now, that it's a little, I have to be a little careful, because these words are dignity and fraternity. You will find the word dignity used, but you'll find it used in its old-fashioned sense, like the way it's used in the Constituent Assembly, if you remember the Constituent Assembly debates about the dignity of the judiciary and the dignity of the president when these articles in the Constitution were being debated. The privileges and immunities, the ambassadors, plenipotentiary ambassadors, and justices, and the president, the office of the president. In each of these discussions in the Constituent Assembly, the word dignity was used over and over again, but it was used in this old-fashioned sense, like it is beneath the dignity of this office. So I saw that it was saying the connection is unstable, so I paused for a minute. I didn't speak. So I don't think you missed anything. I was just being quiet while that little thing was going round and round. Buffering was happening. Okay, so so it's a little bit complicated about the word dignity because it does appear frequently, but the way we mean it, someone had earlier mentioned, Abhishek had mentioned the German Constitution. The way that it's meant, for example, in the first article of the German Constitution, I hope you're familiar with that because it's one of the greatest pieces of legislative writing in human history. The first article of the German Constitution, that human dignity is inviolable, and I'm saying this from memory, so forgive me if I have some of it wrong. It is the duty of the state to protect, promote, and preserve it. So generally in India, we hear a lot about duties in addition to rights, but the first article of the German Constitution is brilliant because it ascribes a duty on the state to promote the inviolable fundamental dignity of the human person. Now, any of you who is aware of global history knows why the German Constitution in the end of the 1940s had to make steps like this, prioritizing in its very first clause the fundamental inviolable dignity of the human person, because the Third Reich, Germany, had spent so much time riding over human dignity throughout the 1940s. So it makes sense that in the new constitution for the German Republic that they should create, they would make the inviolability of human dignity so fundamental. Now the question we have to ask, what about our preamble? Dignity, the appearance of the word dignity. It is not to be found in this German way, this way that is articulated in the first article of the German Constitution, in any of Nehru's writings. So why am I talking about this? Because I had said that we need to understand the difference between author and architect, and just suggesting that the first three narratives are false doesn't mean the fourth one is true. So I want to find hardcore evidence for the truth of the fourth narrative, as opposed to just default evidence. And one of the ways we can do it is to find out if the 6 fundamental features of the preamble appear in the writing and literature of the people who are alleged to have authored it. And what we find in our first narrative, it's saying connection is unstable, so I'm going to pause for a minute. It said connection is unstable, so I paused for a minute. What we found in the first narrative about Nehru is not only disproved by a comparison of the objectives resolution and the preamble, but it is more importantly disproved from seeing it. It is more importantly disproved from seeing the absence of 2 terms, dignity and fraternity, in the vast corpus of Nehru's writings. Now, B.N. Rao was not a prolific writer, the way that Nehru and Ambedkar and Gandhi were, but he still has plenty of work that one can go through. In addition to his own draft constitutions themselves, he did create more than one, which I don't think is common knowledge. And one thing, if you're interested, there is a new biography of B.N. Rao that has come out. I've ordered it, but it's not yet come to me, so I can't see how good it is. Yeah, I will. I'll do a repeat, don't worry. So there's a new biography of B.N. Rao. I haven't seen it, but it might also shed some light on his role in the drafting of the preamble. At least I hope so. But what we know for sure is if we look in what is available from B.N. Rao's writings, the corpus of his work, you do not find these words, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, and nation, all present there. If you look then at the third narrative, Krishnamachari, Munshi, other drafting committee members, Sadullah, for example, by the way, the composition of the drafting committee and the background of the members and so on is all there in the readings that I sent on the Google groups today. So at your leisure, you can have a look at the Shiva Rao's texts, which mention all of these people, who they were, what their background were. Several of them are very interesting. But anyway, if you look in Muhammad Sadullah or Krishnamachari or Munshi, you will not find the use of these terms in the corpus of their writings either. So what does this suggest? This suggests both a negative and potentially a positive evidence for the authorship of the preamble if we are able to find these 6 terms in the corpus of B.R. Ambedkar's writings. And indeed, they're also all available through the NEA website, and you can do searches through all of his writings and speeches. And what you find is that all 6 terms, and especially the terms dignity and fraternity, appear in the manner that they appear in the preamble, in the corpus of Dr. Ambedkar's, in Dr. Ambedkar's corpus, in all of his collected writings and speeches. So we don't have only the default evidence of the authorship, we have a positive evidence of the authorship by seeing that 6 central terms from the descriptive part of the preamble are not there in Nehru's writings, are not there in B.N. Rao's writings, are not there in other drafting committee members' writings, and they are there in B.R. Ambedkar's writings prior to 1948-49. So I hope you understand this is a kind of, what do we say, crime scene investigation, CSI. This is a sort of CSI work. Abhishek is asking about dignity and Germany. I'm going to discuss that when we discuss dignity as a concept, so don't worry. I'm speaking of the first article of the German Constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany and how beautiful and eloquent it is on human dignity. The German word is Menschenwort. And Menschenwort, or human dignity, is regarded as inviolable, which is one thing, but it is also stated that it is the duty of the state to protect and preserve it, which is a completely different and very radical thing, which is why I deeply admire this article of the German Constitution. Anyway, so a kind of CSI investigation of the people who were there, whose fingerprints are on the preamble. We see that of all of the fingerprints on the preamble, if you go into their past work, you don't find each of the concepts in the preamble appearing there. Now, you would think when we talk about an author, not an architect, when we talk about an author, the resources that are available to the author are internal resources as well as external, but internal resources. So, for example, I write many books, as some of you probably know, and if you look at each of these books that I write, you will find a limitation of vocabulary. You'll see that I do not use certain words, so my expression is limited by my vocabulary. And certain other authors are better authors, partly because they have a more robust vocabulary. And what I'm trying to suggest to you is in this CSI type analysis of who's got their fingerprints on the preamble, when we look into the vocabulary of each of these people, we see that only one of them has all 6 of these words in their vocabulary throughout their writings prior to 1948. 49, 1950. And so what we find in the end is that we establish Dr. Ambedkar as the author of the preamble. Okay, I have another internet unstable. Internet was unstable. So in the end, what we find is that we can push forward on the hypothesis that the author of the preamble is B.R. Ambedkar, not only because of the problems faced by the dominant narratives, many of which are right in front of you in that document. You can see the Rao's draft, you can see the objectives resolution. You can read Munshi's memoirs, you can read Krishnamacharya's memoirs from the drafting committee who say, no, it was not me. So we can see through this investigation, not only that the dominant narratives are wrong, but that which narrative must be right because of the availability of the central concepts of the preamble in the corpus of only one of them, and that is B.R. Ambedkar. All right, that's not the only evidence that we're going to find. Now the field is sort of laid out, the terrain is laid out. We have a preamble. We have a preamble that for a long time, 70 years, no one has known who has written. We have a preamble for 70 years, people have proposed 4 narratives. One of the narratives is hugely dominant and it's wrong. The second narrative is known by law students. It's more sophomoric one, but it's also wrong. The third narrative is taught to all of our public school kids because it is useful for nation building, but it is wrong. And so the only one that is left is B.R. Ambedkar as the author of the preamble, but we need more than negative evidence. So we do an investigation into the lexicon, the vocabulary of each of the people who had their hands on the preamble. And we find in this investigation that only one of these people has all 6 of these concepts in his previous history. And so we conclude through this investigation that Dr. Ambedkar is the author of the preamble. Okay, what about the actual mechanics? So this is, we've used logic, we've used investigative techniques and so on. What about the actual mechanics? Don't we have B. Shiva Rao's huge documentary history of the drafting of the Constitution, the Constituent Assembly debates, all of the documents that went into it, the source documents, don't we have the verbatim transcripts of the Constituent Assembly debates? So this is what we're going to start talking about tomorrow. We've reached the time at 7 o'clock. We're going to start talking tomorrow about what do the documents, the transcripts, the minutes, what is the history that we have in the drafting of the preamble, who said what and why, where does it come from and what does it mean? And we're going to focus on the mechanics. And once we focus on the mechanics of the drafting, we're then going to move on to focus on the concepts. So we begin tomorrow with the mechanics, the Constituent Assembly, how they appointed, who they appointed, when they appointed them, when they met, what records are kept, what was said. And in that focus on the mechanics, we're going to go over our running hypothesis that Dr. Ambedkar is the author of the preamble and compare our running hypothesis against the mechanics of the evidence. And then we're going to move on to the concepts and discuss justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, nation in their substantive meaning, as opposed to their mere procedural appearance in the preamble. All right, we've come to 7 o'clock. I hope I was more or less clear to you what we're doing, what we've done, and what we're going to do. And maybe I'll leave it, I'm going to stop the recording.